Okay, so now we're going to do the modifiers chapter. So this is something that a lot of students struggle with, and when I explain it to them, they're like, oh my god, it was that easy? And yes. So if you are struggling with modifiers, usually people don't know what that means, but it's like the sentences that have like a lot of commas everywhere is usually how like students recognize this. So basically there's two types of errors with modifiers. We're going to go over the first one now, which is dangling modifiers. So dangling modifiers are always wrong. So dangling modifier is when like the first part, this bolded part right here before and with the comma, when that part doesn't match what directly follows it, like the subject that it's supposed to be talking about. So here, let's look at the wrong examples first. So like the first one says, having watched the movie, the book will be great. So having watched the movie, like the book comes right after that. The book is not the one who watched a movie. Books don't watch movies, so that's wrong. What directly follows the comma has to be what the preceding part was referring to, the subject it was referring to. So if we wanted to correct that, we would go up here and we would say, having watched the movie, I believe the book will be great. So sometimes we talk like the wrong example and like we get the gist of what someone's trying to say, but technically it's incorrect because we're not following up that introductory phrase with the correct subject. So to correct it, we would do that. And you see some other examples of that too. Tired of failing every test, my parents forced me to study daily. So it's my parents that are following that clause, but the clause was talking about whoever the child was or the student was that was involved, not the parents. So we have to follow that up with that correct subject of Ethan began studying daily. Here it says, upon entering the bookstore, a new novel does not enter a bookstore, so let's correct that. Upon entering the bookstore, I gravitated towards a new novel. Next one, to win the talent show, the dance does not win the talent show. So that is incorrect. To fix it, we would say, to win the talent show, Sanem needed to practice daily. So we followed up with the correct subject. Next one, while doing my homework in class, your teacher does not do homework in class. So that's wrong. Let's fix it to while doing my homework in class, I was caught by my teacher. And the last example, a new student from Florida, Jared's worst fear was meeting his classmates. So this one's a little tricky. It's the fear that becomes the subject in this case. So that's wrong. So we would fix it with a new student from Florida, Jared introduced himself to his classmates. So now let's talk about misplaced modifiers. These are also another error, like that's why it says equals wrong, because misplaced modifiers are wrong. So it's kind of similar to the other one, the dangling modifiers, except it's not going to be where the part is at the beginning of the sentence that has to refer to like whatever we're talking about necessarily. So misplaced modifiers are not placed next to the word or phrase. They modify, but it's not at the beginning of the sentence where we have that introductory phrase part. So you have to fix these obviously. So let's say that we said for this wrong example, Anthony Weber was one of the most prominent members of the Penn Valley Association that donated $30,000 to the local homeless shelter after receiving his annual Christmas bonus. So let's say that we were talking about Anthony Weber being the only one that donated $30,000 to the local homeless shelter. So he's the only one donating from the context of whatever we were saying, but he just happens to be one of the most prominent members of the Penn Valley Association. This would be wrong because it's saying that it's indicating that Anthony Weber is one of many of these prominent members who are donating $30,000. So it's indicating that it's more than just Anthony Weber that are donating $30,000. Now to fix it, we could do one of many things. We could go to this first corrected example that says Anthony Weber, one of the most prominent members of the Penn Valley Association, with commas around it, that way it becomes a non-essential clause, donated $30,000 to the local homeless shelter after receiving his annual Christmas bonus. So there, it's one of those, if you go back to the punctuation chapter, this portion, let me highlight it right here, is in between a pair of commas. So remember, we do that with non-essential clauses. You can also think of them as interruptions of extra information usually. That's non-essential to the entire sentence. So that's one way we could correct it. let's go to the second way. It says one of the most prominent members of the Penn Valley Association, Anthony Weber, donated I cannot talk today. Anthony Weber donated $30,000 to the local homeless shelter after receiving his annual Christmas bonus. So here we have one of the most prominent members of the Penn Valley Association as the introduction right there. And then it's followed up with directly what it's supposed to be talking about, Anthony Weber. So it's indicating like, hey, we're introducing this guy who's one of the most prominent members. And then it's saying like, he's the only one that donated the $30,000. We could also correct it to be Anthony Weber was one of the most prominent members of the Penn Valley Association, and that could be like its own kind of sentence. That's why you could follow it up with a semicolon or a period. And then you would say he donated $30,000 to a local homeless shelter after receiving his annual Christmas bonus. That way you're clearly separating the ideas so that it's not misinterpreted, and we correctly interpret it as Anthony Weber's the only one out of these prominent members who donated that $30,000. He just happens to be a part of this Penn Valley Association, but he's the only one that donated $30,000. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the modifiers quiz 1. If you already have this because you bought my book on Amazon or on TPT, then or one of the chapters on TPT, then I would recommend pausing right now and attempting to do this by yourself, and then trying to correct it by yourself. And if you have trouble understanding why something is wrong, then come back to this video for an explanation. So now let's move on. I'm going to go through these questions on modifiers quiz 1. So it says, born in 1820 in Adams, Massachusetts, women's suffrage became Susan B. Anthony's lifelong mission. So here we have born in 1820 in Adams, Massachusetts is introducing what follows. So we have to make sure that it is followed by the correct subject. So women's suffrage is not born, like it's not born in 1820 in Adams, Massachusetts. That's not who that's referring to. That's supposed to be referring to Susan B. Anthony. So we need to make sure that we follow that up with Susan B. Anthony if we're going to do it with the introductory clause like that. So this one would also be wrong because of that same reasoning. You can't just introduce it like that with that introductory phrase and then follow it up with the wrong subject. So automatically we know A and B is wrong. Now, for answer choice C, it says Susan B. Anthony, who was born in 1820 in Adams, Massachusetts, surrounded by commas, so this is a non-essential, acting as a non-essential clause, made women's suffrage her lifelong mission. So remember I told you in the punctuation chapter, this is like the interruption of extra information. Like you can kind of just like cross that out and see if it makes a sentence that works. Susan B. Anthony made women's suffrage her lifelong mission. That is correct. So it's probably going to be C, but let's go over why it's definitely not D. So it says women's suffrage, born in 1820 in Adams, Massachusetts. So women's suffrage is what this is supposed to be referring to. This clause that's surrounded by commas is supposed to be talking about women's suffrage. Women's suffrage, again, can't be born in 1820 in Adams, Massachusetts. That's supposed to be referring to Susan B. Anthony. So that would be incorrect. Also, you could do the same trick that I used for C, and it's not going to make sense. Women's suffrage became Susan B. Well, actually, that one does make sense. Women's suffrage, this is a good example. I probably put that there specifically because of this. Sorry. This doesn't happen a lot, so I usually just say like that trick works, but this is a good example, and probably why I put that there, of how this doesn't always work. Women's suffrage became Susan B. Anthony's lifelong mission. That technically reads as a correct sentence, but this would still be wrong, even with the cross-out trick, because it's referring to the wrong thing. It's referring to women's suffrage instead of Susan B. Anthony. So usually that trick works, but I did include like, that's why I tell you guys, like most of the time, like it works, but a lot of the time, not a lot of the times, but some of the times you're going to have little like tricks like this. And that's a good example of one. So now let's do number 2. It says the most influential women's rights activist in the 19th century was Susan B. Anthony, who traveled extensively giving speeches. The underlined phrase, or the bolded phrase in this case, in the 19th century could be placed in all of the following except. So this one's not too bad. Most students wouldn't get this one wrong. it would just be D before the word women's. That would be unacceptable because remember, we're trying to pick what does not work when we have these accept problems. So if we were to move this to before the word women's right here, it would read the most influential in the 19th century women's rights activists was Susan B. Anthony, who traveled extensively giving speeches. So you can't put it there. First of all, it just like completely like jumbles up the whole sentence. Like it just is like, it makes no sense. But then also influential needs to go before the noun that it modifies. So influential needs to be placed before, not influential. So if we placed in the 19th century before the word women's, then influential would not be able to go before the noun that it modifies. So that's why it is unacceptable for it to be D. So for number 3, we have advocating for women's suffrage throughout her life. The efforts facilitated by Susan B. Anthony led to significant changes in women's rights. So remember, when we have those introductory phrases like that with the comma following it, whatever comes directly after has to match what it's talking about. So it does not, like advocating for women's suffrage throughout her life, that would have to match what Susan B. Anthony, which it doesn't currently. So let's see if there's an option where it does do that. So right away, I see that Susan B. Anthony would be directly after the comma if we went with either C or D. So now we have to determine which one is the correct answer choice. So C would say advocating for women's suffrage throughout her life, Susan B. Anthony, whose efforts led to significant changes in women's rights. Well, that ends up being a fragment, not a complete sentence. We're waiting for you to finish the complete thought. So then it's not C, so it has to be D, but let's talk about like why it works. So then it would say advocating for women's suffrage throughout her life, Susan B. Anthony facilitated efforts that led to significant changes in women's rights. That's a complete sentence, and after the introductory phrase, we are following it up with the correct subject of Susan B. Anthony. So now let's talk about number 4. So it says Susan B. Anthony, known for her relentless advocacy for women's rights, in 1872 went to the polls and cast a vote a year when women did not have the legal right to vote. Okay, so you might be reading this and thinking like, oh, that sounds pretty good. Like, I don't see anything wrong with it. But something after a comma right here says a year. It says, after the comma, it says a year when women did not have the legal right to vote. Well, the part before the comma is not talking about what year this is referring to. So we have a case of a misplaced modifier here. So the year that it's supposed to be talking about, 1872, has to go right over here before that comma. So automatically, just from that, we can cross out A and B. So now we have to determine, is it C or D? So let's see. Susan B. Anthony, known for her relentless advocacy for women's rights, went to the polls and cast a vote in 1872, a year when women did not have the legal right to vote. That sounds good, but remember, I always want to check all my answers like in these cases, because maybe this one is shorter and it could be that it's the more concise answer choice. So let's see. Susan B. Anthony, known for her relentless advocacy for women's rights, casting a vote in 1872, a year when women did not have the legal right to vote. That's just like you're waiting for the sentence to continue or something. Like, that is not a complete sentence. So that is not correct. So it would have to be C. You could also say, like, if they weren't going for like a longer sentence or a longer idea, I guess, that it's also like a verb tense issue where it shouldn't be like casting. So that could also be like an argument too. So now let's go to Modifiers Quiz 2. Again, remember, if you have this resource, I would recommend doing this quiz on your own first and trying to do corrections by yourself first for the best results, and then coming back to this video for anything that you still need further explanations on. So let's get started. So let's start with number 1. So we're determining this portion, the bolded portion, if we need no change or to correct it with one of these. So let's read the sentence right here. I'm going to highlight it for now. So this is the sentence that we're focused on. Always striving to reform society for the better, Susan's passionate voice became synonymous with women's suffrage, with the women's suffrage movement in the United States. So it's not her voice that's striving to reform society for the better. So I know it can't be this option. I need to make sure that this introductory phrase, always striving to reform society for the better, is followed by the correct subject of Susan, because she's the one doing that, trying to reform society for the better. So let's see what we can, if we can rule anything out from that. So all of the remaining choices, just right off the bat, I see Susan is the first thing, so they've already done that. So it has to be with how they set up the rest that would discount it as the correct, or discount it from being the correct answer. So we have to go further into this. Okay, so now let's go and let's try B. So always striving to reform society for the better, Susan became synonymous with the women's suffrage movement in the United States with her passionate voice. That's totally fine from what I see so far, so let's keep going. Maybe there's a more concise correct answer. So remember, we always have to look out for that. So C says, Susan with her passionate voice became, always striving to reform society for the better, Susan with her passionate voice became synonymous with the women's suffrage movement in the United States. So if we were to do that, we would have this comma right here and this comma right here surrounding this, meaning that this would have to be a non-essential clause. So let's try to read it with the crossed out trick. So always striving to reform society for the better became synonymous with the women's suffrage movement in the United States. That's wrong. That's not even referring to Susan B. Anthony, so no. And then let's try now D. Always striving to reform society for the better, Susan, her passionate voice became synonymous with the women's suffrage movement in the United States. So her passionate voice, so you could say always striving to reform society for the better, Susan became synonymous, you could cross this out and say Susan became synonymous with the women's suffrage movement of the United States, but this is now referring to the wrong thing. Susan, it's you can't say, you can't use her, Susan is not her passionate voice. It's just, you're saying always striving to reform society for the better, Susan, her passionate voice, Susan is not her passionate voice. That just doesn't make any sense. You could say who has a passionate voice or who is known for her passionate voice. You can't just say her passionate voice. That doesn't make sense for referring to Susan. So now we know it can't be D, so it absolutely has to be B. So now I've highlighted the sentence that we're focusing on for number 2. So it says, taking a stand against such injustice, her oratorical skills. So right away, it's not this one, because taking a stand against injustice, oratorical skills don't do that. So it can't be that. It has to be followed by the correct subject. So it can't be C either. It has to be followed up with who was taking a stand against the injustice. So the only correct options would have to be the ones that have it starting with she, as the one that they're referring to taking a stand against incorrect justice. So now let's read the rest to figure out which is the correct one. So taking a stand against such injustice, she was frequently showcasing her oratorical skills as she traveled throughout the country and advocated for women's rights. So this sounds good when you read it, but there's an unnecessary comma right here before as. So can't be that one. There's no justification for why there should be a comma there. So then let's go to D. Taking a stand against such injustice, she frequently showcased her oratorical skills as she traveled across the country and advocated for women's rights. That's perfectly good, perfectly okay. And there's no unnecessary punctuation or anything like that. Reads as a complete sentence. We're good to go.